Good afternoon, everyone. On the occasion of International Archives Week, it is my pleasure to welcome you to a special online event hosted by the United Nations Library and Archives Geneva about a recently published book entitled Archives and Human Rights. My name is Blandine Lucas-Wiffer. I am the Chief of the Institutional Memories section at the Library and Archives, and I will be moderating this event live from the Palais des Nations in Geneva. Before we start, a few words about the organization of the event. It will be divided into two parts. I will first have a discussion with our guests, and then there will be a question and answer session. Today, the platform we are using is WebEx Events. Unfortunately, there are no closed captions on this platform for the moment. To interact with us, there is a Q&A section enabled to the right of your screen. This is where you can ask for assistance from us or ask any question for our speakers throughout the session. Please remember to ask your questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat section. Today's session is mainly in English with a few elements in French. You are most welcome to ask your questions either in English or in French. My colleague Nathalie Alexander will relay the questions for our speakers during the Q&A session. Before opening the discussion, I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers. First of all, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has written the foreword of the book we are presenting today. Mrs. Bachelet, thank you so much for being with us. And we also have the pleasure to have with us the three co-editors of the book, Perrine Canavaggio, Antonio González Quintana, Jens Boel. Perrine will be with us during the first part of the event through a recorded video, and then she will join us live for the Q&A session. I also would like to warmly thank Isabel Allende, the famous writer from Chile, who will be addressing us through a video about her novel A Long Petal of the Sea and the importance of using archives for her as an author of historical fictions. This event today is indeed associated with a recent event organized by UN GenevaReads, the reading circle of the UN Library and Archives. It discussed this novel, inspired by historical events related to the Spanish Civil War and to the Pinochet era in Chile. The discussion broadened horizons and addressed the relevance of archives in relation to the question of political refugees and the violation of human rights. This week is International Archives Week. From 7 to 11 June, the International Council on Archives has invited professionals, organizations, and people worldwide to discuss, among other aspects, the importance of archives to empower accountability and transparency through access to information, for holding governments to account, and ensuring that citizens can protect their rights. In this context, we thought it extremely timely and relevant to organize today's event about the book Archives and Human Rights. Published by Routledge with an open access online version, which is available through the Library and Archives research guide associated with this event. You can find the link on the invitation. The book looks at the role of archives in establishing the facts related to human rights violations, enabling the justice system to bring perpetrators of human rights violations to justice, allowing relatives of victims to find the truth and societies to come to terms with their past. We are particularly aware of this role and its importance at the Library and Archives here at the UN Geneva, as we hold the records of the United Nations Division on Human Rights, which existed from 1946 to 1973, and includes the holdings includes archives related to the drafting of the Universal Declaration. We also are the custodians of the archives of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You will find more information about these archives holdings in the research guide I just mentioned. Without further ado, let me now turn to you, High Commissioner. It is quite difficult to present you and your career in a few words, but I just would like to remind our audience that before becoming the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, you served as President of Chile from 2006 to 2010 and 2014 to 2018. You were the first woman to hold the Chilean presidency. You also were the Executive Director of UN Women from 2010 to 2013. You have written the foreword of this book, and I very much like a sentence you wrote. Archives of human rights violations are not only a tool for looking backwards, they help build society's future. So, from your point of view, why are archives so important to sustain the work done in favor of human rights, and what are the main challenges in this regard?
Well, thank you very much, Valentina. I think it's a pleasure to be able to participate in today's event, which draws attention to the important and complex tasks of archiving in the context of human rights violation. I'm really delighted to share this activity with these three distinguished experts, our archivists. I would like to thank you because your questions allows me to reflect on the importance of archives for the human rights work undertaken by my office. I think one of the central activities of OHCHR's work is what we call monitoring and reporting of human rights violations, which follows firm methodological standards, and the preservation and archiving of documentation of gross human rights violations and other atrocity crimes is as crucial as careful reporting. Archiving is an essential step towards holding those responsible to account, and also contributes to claiming remedy and reparations for the victims and their families. Archives with information on human rights violations are not only, as you mentioned, I put on the forward, a tool for looking backwards. They're also a tool to deter and prevent future violations, hence preventing further conflict and serious harm. In this context, I think that public access to archives about serious violation is crucial, is essential. When people cannot access and discuss information about its past, including about past crimes, is deprived of the possibility to truly understand its history and the complexity of its heritage. And when communities remain frozen in bitterness and mutual misunderstanding, this jeopardizes their ability to settle dispute by non-violent means and to build enduring peace. As a medical doctor, I always say that wounds to heal, they need to be clean. But in the same thing, I need truth and justice and reparation can be done when we know what happened, when we can understand the history. And I think archives have a central role in any process of a society that seeks the truth and acknowledge the grave injustice inflicted. And I myself, as I mentioned, have witnessed the pain suffered by victims of serious human rights violation and their families. And I know how painful it can be for years and even decades to search for and eventually find the truth about what happened. Therefore, archives help bringing a sense of justice, a measure of consolation to families, and contribute to restoring the rights and dignity of the survivors. Truth commissions and other truth-seeking initiatives also enable and promote more objective public understanding of events that have taken place. Hearing each other's grievances and suffering helps developing a common understanding of what has happened as a basis towards reconciliation. And in the long term, archives of truth-seeking mechanisms guarantee the preservation of testimony and constitute educational tools to promote a common understanding of the past and combat denial and revisionism. Archives also play an essential role in preserving national memory, which is a critical process to foster remembrance, recognize and pay respect to the victims' grievances, promote reconciliation, and demonstrate the common will to live in peace. There are also something that is very important, that are memorialization initiatives, whether official or civil society based, are strongly linked to the ability to obtain access to archives and the integrity of those archives. Importantly, archives frequently contain crucial evidence used in criminal trials that educate the commission or involvement of individuals in serious violations. Well-preserved and organized archives are likely to help erasing the perception that a whole community was collectively responsible for massacres, which is often a perception that drives repeated cycles of violence. So many post-authoritarian, post-conflict societies face great challenges in identifying, preserving, and ensuring access to records of mass violations. And these challenges may stem from political reluctance or from capacity considerations, or long-standing denials of academic freedom and the right to freedom of information, expression, and opinion. In this connection, I would like to stress the duty of the state in protecting archives, whether public or privately held, and preventing their possible loss, forging, or destruction, taking duly into account consideration of the security, integrity, and accessibility of the archives. And my office provides advice on the importance of archives, on how to deal with these challenges, notably in situations of political transitions from conflict and repression. Overall, however, the complex and challenging work with and on archives provides a momentum of renewed commitment to rebuild more inclusive societies, while value their own diversity rather than fear it. In this sense, I think archives are a central tool to clarify the past and help societies heal, as I mentioned before. They contribute to transforming societies because understanding and reckoning a violent past is the very basis in efforts to ensure that future violations and conflict are simply unacceptable.
In your former capacity as president of Chile, you have played a key role in the creation of the National Institute for Human Rights and the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago. Could you tell us more about this important personal undertaking?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's essential to understand that in human rights policies, president, prime ministers, and other authorities must deepen and consolidate what has already been done. And this is the case in my country and in other countries. After the military dictatorship in Chile, successive democratic governments put themselves at the service of truth, justice, and reparation. Thus, in parallel to the progress of the legal cases for human rights violations, two commissions made up of people of recognized prestige stand out. The first established the truth about the crimes of the dictatorship with a special emphasis on the disappearance of people. That was called the Retic Commission in 1990. The second told the country what people in political prison has experienced and implemented reparation policy. That was the Bachelet Commission in 2005. And the written record of these two commissions were key documents for establishing the truth about the actions taken during the dictatorship. Along with healing the wounds of 1973 to 1990, the state took on the task of providing itself with instruments to face the challenges of the present. I had the honor of appointing the first female president of the Institute, of the National Human Rights Institute, that was founded as a state agency in 2005 in charge of the promotion and protection of human rights. But we thought, what do we do? How can we really better understand what happened? Because the ones we lived that period, we were in some side, on one side or the other. So how can we build a collective memory? And particularly, and probably in some areas we're not going to agree on that, but how can we do something that is as objective as possible, that will put the facts there? Real facts and not interpretation of those facts. So people will go there, older people, younger people, and they will have their own capacity of reading and understanding what happened. But on the other hand, how can we ensure that this never happens again? So that's how can we ensure that new and younger generations can understand the risk of not being able to, in a society, to find peaceful solution for the normal conflict of interest. So we decided I decided, and also because it was the bicentenary of my country in 2010, that we should create a museum of memory and human rights. And I think, and as I said, the mission was to prevent us from forgetting the horror lived during the dictatorship, but also to give recognition to victims, to the fighters for human rights, and in a very special way, to ensure that these events are never repeated. It was a part of an effort to integrate the values of respect, tolerance, and justice in our coexistence, from the school curricula to the new relationship with indigenous peoples. And we see with the current advances in our democratic deepening that this path does not stop. The culture of human rights is always a work in progress. And I think one of the more important things that I saw, because this is all what is there was given to us. I mean, there was press information, there were videos at the time, but also a lot of victims. They gave us their letters, they did when they were in prison, they did some handcraft and so on, but also what happened to the children and so on. So it's full of pictures, I mean, real ones. And so I have been very happy to see how young generations go there, have their own idea. And the main message that I wrote there at the beginning and at the end is, we cannot change the past, but the future depends on us. And democracy depends on us. So we have to learn the lessons, and we all have a responsibility in ensuring a future Chile that is peaceful and with sustainable peace. And we do not make the same mistakes and of the past. Because of course, some in Spanish, mistake is error, but in English as well, error. People could have done errors, but it's different to do errors than to do horrors. And when we need to ensure that never those horrible things happen again in our country. And I think it has played an essential role. An archive, and that museum not only has this sort of presents all these things, but also have archives that permits to many researchers on human rights from the country or outside the country to go there, to look on all the information that we brought from many NGOs who worked during including the one I worked at that time, working with the children that were victims of the dictatorship. They brought all these documents so people in the future can all know what happened and how we can also try to prevent that from happening again.
Yes, I would like to add that we, as the Library and Archive from the UN Geneva, we contributed with some copies of UN documents for this museum. I also had the opportunity to visit the museum myself, and as an archivist and citizen, I was really very much impressed.
Thank you. May I just add one little thing before doing it, because it was a decision that I took, but I sent people to visit all kinds of museums everywhere. So we could see with the ICRC here, but we went to South Africa to see the Apartheid Museum and so on, to try to find out what was the most important thing, but also we tried to make it a place that would be beautiful. I mean, even though what there was not beautiful, but a place where people will feel they need to go, they could have like a moment of reflection, but also a moment of commitment with democracy and human rights.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bachelet. We understand that you have a very busy agenda and you may not be able to stay with us until the end of the discussion. But
yes, I may, but I'm going to read the book anyway.
Thank you so much. Let us now continue our discussion by exploring the content of the book. A couple of days ago, I met with Perrine Canavaggio, who talked to me about the genesis of the book. Perrine Canavaggio is a French archivist. She was chief curator of the archives of the Presidency of the French Republic from 1974 to 1994. She was Deputy Secretary General of the International Council on Archives, the ICA, from 2009 to 2010. From 2003 until now, she has successively been co-founder and chair of the ICA Working Group on Archives and Human Rights, and she is currently a member of the Executive Committee of the ICA section on Archives and Human Rights. The interview, which took place in French, was recorded and will be played now with English subtitles.
Canavaggio, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Alors, on comprend à la lecture de l'ouvrage Archives and Human Rights, vous êtes la co-éditrice, non seulement l'importance, mais aussi la complexité de ce sujet, pour lequel il a été fait appel à des auteurs relevant de multiples disciplines. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire plus sur la genèse du livre et cette nécessaire pluridisciplinarité?
Oui, alors quand nous avons créé ce groupe de travail en 2003, nous avons constaté le cloisonnement des professions et la méconnaissance qu'avaient les archivistes et les juristes de leurs travaux et de leurs problématiques respectives. Le meilleur exemple était l'ignorance par les archivistes du rapport de Louis Joinet sur la lutte contre l'impunité, qui arrivait pourtant aux mêmes conclusions que le rapport du Conseil international des archives sur les archives des services de sécurité des anciens régimes répressifs, alors qu'il n'y avait eu aucune concertation entre les auteurs. De même, la société ignorait la dimension sociale du travail de notre profession et en avait en général une vision uniquement patrimoniale. C'est pourquoi nous avons décidé de raconter la rencontre entre les archivistes et les défenseurs des droits de l'homme et de présenter dans un livre les expériences et les avancées obtenues depuis 2003 en les illustrant par des études de cas. Et nous avons fait appel à des auteurs d'horizons différents pour présenter 17 cas provenant des 4 continents. Archivistes, juristes, membres de commissions vérité, spécialistes de sciences politiques, historiens. Ils ont des points de vue et des perspectives complémentaires sur les nombreux usages des archives en cas de violation grave des droits de l'homme, usages judiciaires, politiques, réparatoires, mémoriels, éducatifs et préventifs.
Alors, la publication du livre apparaît comme un aboutissement, le résultat d'un long processus favorisé par le travail d'un groupe de professionnels au sein de la section sur les archives et les droits de l'homme du Conseil international des archives. Qu'en a-t-il été exactement?
Alors, pour remédier à ce cloisonnement et pour sensibiliser aux enjeux des archives le grand public, les juristes, les ONG de défense des droits de l'homme et les pouvoirs publics, nous avons organisé des colloques interdisciplinaires et nous avons participé à des forums internationaux des droits de l'homme. Un livre intitulé « Politique archivistique pour la défense des droits de l'homme » a été publié. Il propose des politiques globales qui protègent non seulement les archives des services de police et de sécurité, mais aussi celles des ONG et celles des institutions de la justice transitionnelle, tribunaux pénaux internationaux et commissions vérité. Nous avons également lancé des actions pour professionnaliser et normaliser le traitement et l'accès à ces archives dans les organisations disposant de peu de moyens. Un manuel a été publié sur la gestion des archives des ONG et nous avons soutenu le développement du logiciel libre Atom, Access to Memory. Des principes de base, enfin, relatifs au rôle des archives pour la défense des droits de l'homme, ont aussi été élaborés pour aider et pour soutenir les archivistes confrontés à ce type de documents.
Alors, l'ouvrage a été préfacé par Madame Michèle Bachelet, haut commissaire des Nations Unies pour les droits de l'homme, que nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir pour cet événement. Quel a été plus spécifiquement le travail effectué par cette section en lien avec les Nations Unies et le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme en particulier?
Alors, grâce à l'appui de Louis Jouannet, nous avons été introduits auprès du Haut Commissariat qui a organisé des séminaires auxquels nous avons participé en tant qu'experts. Des avancées essentielles ont été rapidement constatées avec plusieurs résolutions de la Commission puis du Conseil des droits de l'homme, résolutions qui mentionnent l'importance des archives pour l'exercice du droit à la vérité. Depuis 2013, les rapporteurs spéciaux des Nations Unies sur la promotion de la vérité, de la justice et de la réparation font régulièrement référence aux archives dans leurs rapports annuels. Ils soulignent l'importance cruciale des archives pour permettre aux victimes et aux populations d'exercer leur droit à la vérité, à la justice et à la réparation, notamment dans les pays en transition vers la démocratie. Le rapport de Pablo de Greff de 2015 concerne les garanties de non-répétition et il insiste sur la contribution que les archives peuvent apporter à la prévention. Il recommande l'adoption de politiques archivistiques globales et de législation adaptée. Il contient en annexe un ensemble de recommandations sur la préservation et l'accès aux archives des commissions vérité. Enfin, le rapport de Fabienne Salvioli, le dernier de 2020, insiste, lui, sur la nécessité de rendre accessibles les archives pour faciliter les processus de mémorialisation et donc la prévention.
So, after this, thank you very much, Perrine. After this overview of the process which led to this important publication, with the intervention of many authors from very different backgrounds, let's now go deeper into the subject. And first of all, with you, Antonio González Quintana, a member of the Spanish Corps of Archivists from 1985, you served as the director of the Civil War Archive in Salamanca from 1986 to 1994. You were Deputy Director General of Archives in the Community of Madrid between 2010 and 2018 when you retired. You are currently the chair of the section on archives and human rights of the ICA. Antonio, you are a specialist of the Spanish Civil War and of what you call the amnesic model of the Spanish transition. Would you please explain this concept and its consequences, also expanding to other cases, especially in South America? Can you please unmute?
Good afternoon. Yes, I try to do it. Spanish contemporary history offers us a paradigmatic example of the importance of public policies of memory, or in this case, in the Spanish case, the lack of them. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, the victory of rebels, supported by the Nazi and fascist regimes of Germany and Italy, a bloody dictatorship was established in Spain. A deep repression took place, in which thousands of persons were killed because they were members of political parties, members of trade union associations, members of social movements supporting Popular Front, its government elected in February 1936, or because the political opinions. Many others were condemned to large periods by military courts. We have also the drama of refugees, so well described by Isabella Allende novel A Long Petal of the Sea, and so of actuality the crisis of Syria or refugees, for example. We must remember that near 500,000 Spanish Republican refugees escaped France and its colony, Algeria. Later, an important number of them would get refuge in other countries, especially in Latin American countries, Chile among them. Many of these facts, as the repression, the fascism, murder, and disappearance of political enemies, concentration camps, war prisoners of their use, slave manpower, are patterned up now in Spain. We may wonder why. Archives all around the world, not only in Spain but other places, are full of information on the Spanish repression, refugees, invasion, or exile, and the evidences are so strong. I think that the gap on policies of memory and the existence of closed or hidden archives related to human rights violations have offered an opportunity to relativism, laundering, or directly for the denial or negativism of the Spanish fascism and of the murders and systematic violations of human rights produced in Spain from 1939 to 1978, in occasion extended transition period. This is one of the consequences of an amnesic transition to democracy. After Franco's death, it began political transition to democracy in Spain that was based in a deal between government and opposition, so-called agreed breaking. In that deal, silent about the crimes committed by the dictatorship was the only policy regarding the past. No trials, no inquiries about crimes, only amnesia in the framework of an amnesty law approved in 1977, which meant the freedom for political prisoners and coming back of exiled persons, but also meant the pardon for the authorities, officials, or members of the armed forces and security bodies that have committed gross crimes for 15 October 1977. It was a pact of silence. It was accepted that the task of creating a democratic society would be easier without looking back and turning the page to go forward with reconciliation. No justice, neither memory nor location of graves of disappeared persons, near 100,000. The amnesia model was besides shown sometimes as a good solution for other countries in transition, as you asked, mainly in Latin America. Chile, it was the own Pinochet government during the dictatorship who approved an amnesty law 2 months after the Spanish amnesty law was approved. In Argentina, besides another self-amnesty law at the end of the dictatorship, the laws on final point and due obedience closed the possibility of judging many crimes committed in repression after the Great Trial against. The fact of the truth has been very difficult in those countries, but finally, the need to know, opposed to the need to forget, has come back after generations, demonstrating that it's not possible to build a real democratic, peaceful country without truth, justice, and reparation. And in that building, archives are essential. Archives policies must be developed to support any memory policy. Spain, Argentina, and Chile are good examples. These countries have taken a step to change the situation in the field of memory policies many years later. Néstor Kirchner delegated the amnesty laws of the modern time in Chile. The Supreme Court in 1998 decided not to apply the amnesty law in the cases of crimes against humanity or international humanitarian law. And Madame Bachelet, as seen, decided to create a national memory concern and presented a project to derogate the amnesty law, although it has not been debated yet. Perhaps these steps haven't got a parallel way in archival policies.
Thanks a lot, Antonio, for having highlighted the consequences of amnesia, which progressively led to the concept of duty to remember, coined by Louis Joinet, to whom the book is dedicated. Archives are playing a key role in the process of remembering or not forgetting. In this respect, it seems that the 1990s were a turning point in the recognition of this role. From a general perspective, what changed? How did it change?
In the 90s, things changed in the world of archives, absolutely. The occupation by the citizens of Germany, Eastern Germany, of the Stasi archives in Berlin in 1990, and the creation of the Federal Commissioner for the Administration of the Stasi archives opened the way for a real change in the role of archives in political transitions. The scope of the transitional justice initiatives found in archives an excellent tool for justice, reparation, truth. The management of archives of the former security services in countries coming from totalitarian regimes to democracy became a crucial point of interest for archivists. So the International Council on Archives decided, in cooperation with UNESCO, in 1993 to prepare a set of guidelines on this subject, finally published in 1997. I would like to remember here, if possible, talking about Chile, to Alejandro González Poblete, died in 2003, and who was one of the members of this team, UNESCO National Council on Archives, to prepare these guidelines. He was also one of the most important persons in the Vicaría de Solidaridad in Chile for finding documents against repression. But it's also the time, 90s, in which the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations region produced his report on the impunity of crimes against impunity and his set of principles combat impunity about them scope role, in which this report, records and archives have an enormous important role. The archives of memory in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic gave with the German Commission a new model for archival policies regarding records of the security services at the time of political transitions, although in other countries, as Brazil, Portugal, or Spain, where the national archives institutions created those records and archives, also in a positive way. The 90s were also the years of creation of very important transitional justice institutions. In the first place, the national tribunals for Yugoslavia or the tribunal for Rwanda, 1993 and 1994. In second place, the truth commissions, very important truth commissions in Chile, South Africa, El Salvador, Guatemala, produced their reports in these 10 years, in the 90s, that period. And this transitional justice mechanism also produced a huge number of new evidences, records, and archives on the convulsive past of those countries. And it was also a need to preserve and advance these records and to give access to them. The 90s put the human rights in the agenda of archives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antonio. If archives play an immense role in avoiding that individuals and societies forget facts which happened in reality, they can also be a very useful resource for authors of fictions who use historical facts as a background. A couple of weeks ago, our reading circle, the UN GenevaReads, discussed a novel recently published by Isabel Allende, The Long Petal of the Sea, which is about the many thousands of refugees escaping the Spanish Civil War to France, and then follows a few of them who managed to travel to Chile on the Winnipeg, a ship chartered by the poet Pablo Neruda. And the novel is based on a true story and around real historical events. Let us now listen to Isabel Allende herself, who very kindly recorded a video message especially addressed to us.
Hi, I am Isabel Allende, and I'm a writer, a literary writer, but I have written several historical novels. And I find it fascinating because in a novel, you can go deeper into an event, a time, and a place. And you get information that often is not in the history books. When you research journals, personal letters of people who witnessed the events, then you get another side of the story. History books are written by the winners, usually white males. To find the voices of the silent majority, as it is called, of the women, the children, the people who lost the battles, the poor, the displaced. That's my job as a literary writer. And I find that, of course, in archives, and the archives are essential. I recently published a novel called A Long Petal of the Sea, which is the story of 2,200 Spanish refugees from the Civil War in Spain that were received in Chile as refugees, thanks to the poet Pablo Neruda, who bought a cargo ship, conditioned it to transport passengers, and sent these people to Chile, where they were received with open arms. Their descendants, thousands of them, have really contributed enormously to the culture in Chile. My job as a writer was to find those voices, was to read the archives, of course, and the history books of the account of what happened, but also find the voices of the people who were the children of those passengers, and even one of the passengers of the ship, the Winnipeg, my friend Victor Pey, who told me all the details in the book that it would have been impossible to find without having his help. Unfortunately, my friend died 6 days before I could send him the manuscript to Chile, dedicated to him. He was 103 years old and perfectly strong and lucid, and he died in his sleep. So I think that documents in the archives can be like the foundation where we build the fiction of a historical novel. The characters, which are fictional most of the time, move around, move the story, but always on a very solid foundation. As a writer, I am very careful because I know that historians and people who specialize in certain themes will be looking very carefully at my book. I remember, for example, when I wrote a book about the slave revolt in Haiti, and the archives and the documentation was so hard because it was half of it in French, and because the times were very tumultuous and things were really changing in Europe day by day, and therefore changing in the colonies as well. My job is, in this creation of a fiction that is historical fiction, is to talk about the pain and the suffering of people, not about the victories, not about the dates or the conquests. That is for historians. For me, it's the soul, it's the sentiments, the relationships, and as I said before, the losses, the suffering, which is enormous in every instance. and usually gets washed away in the memory of society. So I like my job, and I hope to be able to write many more historical novels like A Long Petal of the Sea. In The Long Petal of the Sea, I had the possibility of talking to people because it's a recent event. It only happened 80 years ago. When I go back in history, really back, then it's harder. But it's always possible to find in archives and in libraries and in personal journals the information I need. Thank you.
We would like to thank Isabel Allende for the message she was conveying in this video, where she was showing how important for her as a literary writer it is to have access to archives and also to write about history, but at a different level as currently is in history books. She says that it's very important to her to talk about the suffering of people, and she said that it's not in history books that she finds this material to write about this, but in archives and in personal letters and she researches a lot in archives. I think that as she explains, archives can bring an insight on more personal and emotional elements than usual. And before we continue the discussion, we would like to share with you actual archives, a few incredible documents, part of them shared to us by Antonio Quintana, and part of them from our own holdings here in the UN Geneva archives that are directly related to the topic discussed by Antonio and featured by Isabel Allende. So we will show you the documents in a few moments. The document you will see, again, are coming from different institutional sources, part of them from different archival institution in Spain, and some of them, as the first document you can see on screen, from our own UN archives in Geneva. This document is about the international conference for the Spanish refugees, which was held in Paris in July 1939. And what is interesting, if you have Isabel Allende's book in mind, is that this conference was attended by Pablo Neruda and also by Gabriela Mistral, another Chilean poet. Here, a document that Antonio shared with us, which is a letter from a passenger of the Winnipeg. So he's telling about the journey. And this is from private papers. So another source. You have institutional archives, private archives. A letter, an official letter, again from our own archives, from the delegation of Chile to the Council of the League of Nations concerning the evacuation of Spanish refugees, which is one of the stories told by Isabel Allende in her book. And on the same topic, a letter from a refugee himself from the Argelès-sur-Mer camp that Isabel Allende is telling a lot about, and a sad story for the refugees. Another camp with a photo of the refugees. And to finish with something which is not very well known, but you can see a photo of artworks from the Spanish treasures, including from the Prado Museum, which were evacuated to Switzerland during the Spanish Civil War, and to be protected were stored for a few months, a few meters from in a room a few meters far from the place I'm sitting today and I'm talking to you. And it's actually, this room is today our UN Geneva Museum, where we have a permanent exhibition about the history of the League of Nations and the UN Geneva. So we thought that we are talking a lot about archives and it was important for you to see actual archives. Antonio would like to add a few words. You're muted.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to share with you these documents.
Thank you. I now would like to turn to you, Jens Boel. You are a Danish archivist and historian. You were the Chief Archivist of UNESCO from 1995 to 2017. You also were a co-founder in 2003 of the ICA Human Rights and Archives Working Group, and currently you are a member of the Executive Committee of the ICA section on archives and human rights. Jens, one of the things which makes this book extremely interesting, and I would even say effective in highlighting the importance of using archives to shed light on human rights violations and in supporting truth and reconciliation, is the variety of case studies it includes. Could you please bring some of these examples to our audience?
Yes, thank you, Blondine, and hello, everybody. But first, I want to thank the UN Library and Archives for organizing this session, and also I wish to thank the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, for attending and for having talked to us, and also, of course, for having prefaced the book. Well, Blondine, yes, indeed, there are many examples from around the world which show how archives can support the right to know and the fight for justice. As Perrine mentioned earlier, we have 17 cases in the book. Now, every single one of these could merit a whole webinar of its own. So I'll just take 3 of these case studies. In Cambodia, the discovery of Khmer Rouge archives in Phnom Penh and elsewhere in the country after the fall of the Pol Pot regime made it possible to get factual knowledge of what happened during those terrible years from 1975 to 1979. Vincent de Wilde, he was one of the prosecutors of the trial against the Khmer Rouge leaders, trial for crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. And Vincent de Wilde is the author of this Cambodia chapter in the book. He explains that without the Khmer Rouge archives, the trial would probably not have been possible. This was the largest and probably the most complicated criminal case in the history of international law since Nuremberg. So we must remember that we are talking about crimes that led to the killing of approximately 2 million people. During the trial, the testimonies were, of course, they were essential. Testimonies of victims and of other witnesses. However, they were very forceful, powerful, but they also had the weakness that could be attacked, questioned, because they often were not very precise in terms of time. So the defense of the accusers could indeed put them in question. Also, we have to remember this was the process. The trial took place 31 years after the repression began in 1975. The trial only began in 2006. That's why the records, the documents, they are essential because they could corroborate testimonies. They could lead to objective facts. And in the end, as Vincent de Wilde shows, they actually led to verdicts against the main responsible for crimes against humanity. During the process, the documents were also scrutinized for forgery, possible distortion, and so on. So the whole process led to a situation where the records could prove the guilt of the accused. Finally, also from Cambodia, I would like to say that Vincent de Wilde shows that the Cambodian experience, it inspired the United Nations to take proactive action in countries like Myanmar and Syria, so that crimes against humanity, human rights violations could be documented already while they were being committed. So instead of waiting until the possible installation of democratic transition. Well, I'll take another example from Africa, Chad, where Hissène Habré was a dictator in the 1980s. The author of this case study is Henri Tullier. After the fall of the dictator Hissène Habré in 1990, there was a strong demand for justice in Chad, but there were very few documents that could prove the involvement of perpetrators. So therefore, there were very few verdicts. What happened then was in 2001, a journalist who worked with Human Rights Watch, he got permission to visit a prison that was called La Piscine, the swimming pool, which was in fact a torture center, and during the dictatorship. And he discovered thousands of documents just lying on the floor and in a bad state. But those documents, they were examined, and that made it possible to understand and to prove responsibilities and lines of authority, just like in Cambodia. So one particular document can be considered as a smoking gun. This is a memo from Hissène Habré in which he instructs the Minister of Defense to no longer let any prisoner of war, as he puts it, out of the swimming pool, unless that prisoner was dead. Habré made that point. He claimed that because he claimed that in some cases, prisoners who got out of the swimming pool, out of the prison, then were helped to escape by the International Red Cross. This handwritten memo is so important because it shows the direct responsibility, the control, the management of Hissène Habré on the detention center. And then the handwritten memo was scrutinized. A handwriting expert concluded that it was authentic, and it was indeed Hissène Habré who had written this. Of course, there were many other documents. There was other evidence that led to the verdict against Hissène Habré, but this was a crucial document, which that's why I wanted to mention this. And then my third example, the last one, is from again another part of the world, from Guatemala, where 200,000 people were killed and 45,000 disappeared without trace in the late 70s and during the 1980s. Kirsten Weld, a historian from Harvard University, tells the amazing story of what happened to the police archives in her chapter in our book. Well, you would have to read the chapter to get all the dramatic details. But very briefly, in the late 90s, the government, which was close to the military and other perpetrators of human rights violations, it claimed that all evidence had been lost. And in fact, there were practically no documents that could be used by the commission that examined human rights violations. So, well, the commission nevertheless arrived at a conclusion on the violations committed, but then the military rejected the conclusions by arguing that they were not backed by documentary evidence. What happened then was in 2005, in a warehouse of a police base in Guatemala City, investigators just by chance accidentally found 75 million pages of police records in a terrible state. But these records were restored, dealt with by archives. They were used, and then afterwards they were used in trials and also by families of victims. They were used they served the public in knowing what had happened during the dictatorship. So, however, as Kirsten Weld shows in her chapter, archive power is an essential part of state power. And with political changes in Guatemala, as of in particular from 2016, access to these archives has become much more complicated. Fortunately, about 20 million pages have been digitized and are preserved also in safe havens around the world. So that's a change, but the fight for access continues in Guatemala and elsewhere.
Thank you, Jens, for these very powerful cases. You just highlighted the role of archives. What about the role of archivists, and what about other stakeholders?
Yes, well, it could be said that archivists are supporting human rights simply by doing their job. I mean, by organizing archives, by preserving them, by providing access. But of course, the story doesn't end there. There's more to it. There are particular ethical issues and personal dilemmas, professional challenges in this context. And that's why the Working Group on Archives and Human Rights developed a document called The Basic Principles on the Role of Archivists and Records Managers in Support of Human Rights. Sorry, it's a long title, but this expresses exactly what it is. It is about the role of archivists and records managers, and this document was endorsed by the International Council on Archives as a working document in 2016. This document, these principles, they advise on how archivists and records managers can act in critical situations. For instance, if they receive illegal instructions to destroy collections of archives that could prove human rights violations or could help victims or survivors, families of victims to find out about the truth of what happened to their loved ones. So it provides advice. It also encourages archivists and records managers to include information about human rights collections and archives that can serve human rights purposes in archival descriptions, take the human rights dimension into account in appraisal decisions, and a whole range of professional areas. Those basic principles, they help. But in addition to this, I mean, those principles, they are available on your website, the website that has been that accompanies this webinar. So everybody who attends this can, for instance, see the basic principles there or on the website of the International Council on Archives. So much for the professionals, but you also mentioned civil society, and it's true, we also show it in the book. There are heroic examples from Argentina, from Chad, for instance, of individuals who are not at all archivists, but who wants to transmit the truth of what happened from prisons, from the torture center ESMA in Buenos Aires. I mean, those people played a crucial role. And in more general terms, if you look at Rwanda as an example, we also have a chapter on Rwanda in the book. If you look at what is called the Gacaca courts, 12,000 Gacaca courts with villagers getting together and confronting the accused. I mean, people who are accused of having committed mass murder and other human rights violations. In particular, the audiovisual records of this are extremely powerful. And this process, the Gacaca courts, is a strong, powerful example of how civil society at large get involved in in acknowledging what happened and getting to terms with a painful past and getting closer to an understanding of what happened, to justice and the truth.
Thank you very much, Jens. We are now close to the end of the first part of our event, the discussion. I think it was a really very rich discussion. I would like to thank all our speakers. If I would like to summarize the discussion in a take-home message, I think I would say that duty to remember goes together with a duty to collect, preserve, and access to and give access to archives, which are an essential tool to collectively overcome human rights violations and to be able to go forwards into the future. So the discussion was so rich that I'm sure we have a lot of questions, and I'm pleased to open the Q&A session with you, Jens, Perrine, and Antonio. And I would like to welcome my colleague Nathalie Alexander, who is working behind the scenes to collect the questions that you asked through the Q&A section. And so Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Blondine, and thank you to those who've submitted questions so far. We do invite you, if you do have questions for us, because there's still time to ask it in the Q&A section, so please go ahead if you have a question. Our first one is, if you should name just one priority in the future of work on archives in support of human rights, what would that priority be? Back to you, Blondine.
Yes, so Jens, Antonio, Perrine, who would like to start answering that question?
Well, maybe I can start by saying that indeed, of course, there are many priorities, and in the the archives, the section on archives and human rights, we are right now working on a vision paper where we try to identify the most important priorities. Access is crucial, and I mean liberal access to archives, and that's the case all over the world. It's not only an issue in authoritarian systems, also in countries with a long democratic tradition, it is a real issue. So if I should name just one priority, I would mention the businesses, the multinational businesses. I think it is crucial that some kind of mechanism is established that enable people, public and victims of human rights violations in particular, to hold multinational businesses and other corporations responsible in cases where they may have been involved in human rights violations. And I'm stressing this because right now this concept and this dimension is not included in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We in the section, we think they should be, and we'll work for that. And if you look at what happened in Latin America in the 1970s with United Fruit's involvement in human rights violations, if you look at in Africa, the Cobalt Wars, also if you look at Iraq with Blackwater, for instance, where police work was outsourced to private companies, then many of these companies in different ways, they were involved in situations where human rights were violated, and it should be a right for citizens to hold those businesses accountable. So I would point to that as one big priority.
And Antonio, what would be your priority? Can you unmute? We can't hear you. We can't hear you, Antonio.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would like to add something to what Jens has told us priorities for us, for the section on archives and human rights. I agree with all of them, but I think if we can put together our action with the goals of the Agenda 2030 and those points of development sustainable, I would like to mention the point 16 of those points, and they call in for preserving the birth registries. It's very important for kids, for children, the protection of these registries and the establishing of them in those countries where it doesn't exist. So I think one of our tasks is also to identify those records, those institutions producing records that are essential for human rights. And the right to identity is based in the public birth registries. And it's a pity, but in many countries, there are children under the 40% registered. Only 40% of them are registered at the age of 60 years. So in my opinion, this is one crucial point to think about and to develop in the future. Also, all these vulnerable collectives, women, children, so on. And of course, the worth of business, in which I would call attention on the archives of their own corporations, archives of enterprises. The possibility of accessing public records is not easy always, but usually we have got the laws on freedom of information to help us, at least in the framework of legal instrument. But in the case of the private world and in the case of transnational corporations or enterprises, this access is much more difficult. And I think, as Jens has told, the guiding principles of the United Nations, the Ruggie principles, are not enough. We're waiting for the treaty that has been announced in dissent, and we're trying to call the attention on including references to the protection records created by the own enterprises and the right to access them by the victims of abuses in the case they exist, and the use by courts, tribunals, and so on. And I think it's a point to consider very, very deeply.
Thank you. And Perrine, your priority?
Thank you. Of course, I agree with my friend's priorities. My priority, my first priority, would be to fight negationism, and what a Belgian historian calls crimes against history, which are still ongoing in some countries. This should be done by opening access to archives, to allow historians to objectively establish the facts, and only restrict this access if it really harms the privacy, the protection of privacy, or the higher state interest. The right to the truth and the right to information imply the right of individual and society to objectively know their personal and collective history. A better understanding of the recent history could contribute to the prevention of conflicts and violations of human rights. My second priority, if I can follow, would be the long-term digital preservation and help NGOs that are working in the field of human rights to preserve their records. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. This is a point I wanted to raise. It's the challenges of digital preservation in today's world. The archives documenting human rights violations are mostly digital, and preserving them for the long term is a huge challenge.
If I can hand in,
yes.
Only to add this point exposed by Perrine, not only the preservation, but also the challenge of protecting human rights also in the digital media, also in electronic records, electronic archives, is also a challenge for archivists. that archives and records continue playing the same role they play in the physical wealth of paper, in the future wealth of electronics records.
Yes, thank you. So Natalie, over to you for a second question.
Thank you, Blondine. And on that point about digitization, we do have a few questions about that, so perhaps we can address that a little bit more now. There's one question coming in from Carla, thank you. In your opinion, will it be easier or more complicated to consult archives on human rights in the future for periods when sources have been created in e-version only, so no physical documents? So that's a question from Carla. Back to you, Blondine, before we cover a few others.
Yes, thank you. This is a very good follow-up question, actually. So, Berin, would you like to start?
I'm not very optimistic.
Why?
But, okay, it depends on the countries. But yesterday I read the report from the International Federation on Human Rights for Human Rights, and all the problems raised and the pursuit for historians. So I'm not sure to be able to answer this.
Jens or Antonio? Jens?
Well, I'm by temperament an optimist, so I'm sorry. I completely acknowledge what Perrine just said, and I would say it's a dialectical process. I mean, there are huge obstacles and problems. At the same time, there's also much more awareness now of the importance of these issues in civil society and even some governments. I think it's what is at stake is a strong involvement of civil society and also academic communities. I mean, historians, political scientists, and journalists, and many other user communities to indeed to fight for this, to try to ensure better access to digital information preservation and so forth. Maybe I should also say that among the priorities we discuss in the section on archives and human rights is endangered websites, in particular by minority groups. It could be indigenous populations, it could be LGBT or others. So this is, I mean, we are not a huge group, but as far as we can do anything to impact the agenda, this is one of the points where we'd like to make a difference.
Well, in my opinion, the fight for transparency, fight for freedom of information, it's a long fight, and we have got a good moment, and we have now laws on freedom of information nearly in all countries in the world, most of the countries of Latin America, and I think that we have done very strong steps forward. But it's true that in this fight for transparency, we have always enemies inside and outside governments, and it's not always easy to think that things won't be used, technologies in this case, to favorize the extraction or the hidden of documents more easy using these technologies. But on the contrary, I think it's very important that the digital world offers to nearly everybody the capacity to create their own archives, their own electronic and digital archives. This is a possibility for individuals or for little NGOs or for little associations of defenders of human rights, of victims, of particular people who has the opportunity to create these evidences and to preserve them only using their mobile phone or their personal computers, the possibility of preserving these evidences has come very strong. Perhaps the challenge is to preserve them in a long term. And there, I think the archival policies of the states, of the countries, may help to do this work, supporting these private institutions with repositories and with other kind of elements to facilitate the constitution of good personal or private archives.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes for a few more questions. So, Nathalie?
Yes, great. Thanks, Blondine. There have been a few more questions on the digital side, looking at access. So despite the great gains we've made by being able to digitize a lot of archives, perhaps not all archives have this capacity yet. So how can we ensure access and accessibility? And that also links to another question about inclusivity. So beyond accessibility, how can we make sure that different groups and different parts of society can access these archives, whether students, NGOs, lawyers, historians, etc. Back to you, Blondine.
Thank you. Would like to start? Yes.
Well, it's an excellent question. It's not easy to answer. In fact, it's with regard to, what should I say, the principles and the policies in place in the basic principles, which I mentioned before, the basic principles on the role of archivists and records managers, the equal access for all is one of the important principles. So everybody should have a right to access. But between the should have and actually have, there is, of course, a big gap. The number of archive services around the world, and Blondine, you're well placed to talk about this, do what they can to digitize their holdings and also to inspire or encourage others to do it. The International Council on Archives does its part as well. I mean, I think it's important to stress international solidarity in this context. After all, international archival community is organized in the ICA. There are other organizations as well. The ICA is the most important for the archival community. And here there are multiple possibilities of supporting digitization activities. Not a lot of money, but there is a sharing of expertise and so on. UNESCO can also play a role. I mean, there are a number of players around. So I think it's again important to continue to raise awareness, put pressure, but also to benefit, to use the many networks that actually exist and who can support easier access and more digitization around the world.
Perrine and Antonio, do you have anything to add, or we move to the next question?
I would only make one additional point, is that perhaps not always is necessary to have a digital copy of records. Not always is necessary or even good to have all records on the website. I think the most important and the first is to locate the records, to have the capacity to locate them, and then to have the capacity of accessing. But not always is the same to put in a digital portal or a digital platform 1,000 million of records that to have a very easy access to them. If you have not a good database with information on what is preserved and what can you access, sometimes the images only don't work, and sometimes we expend a lot of money in copying in digital form, and perhaps this money would be better use it for describing programs in archives and records.
You would like to add anything?
Just to add that our section has a project of directory of human rights collections.
It's interesting, as I mentioned briefly when we were showing the slideshow with archives, it was a good example of how on one topic you can have sources from different institutions, and Proton is usually very, very useful to have access to all these different sources. Nathalie, another question?
Yes, thanks, Blondine. Firstly, for those who are wondering, there is access to the book Archives and Human Rights in a research guide that we'll show at the very end of the event today. But then to another question that's a bit more specific. What was the role of archives in the Pinochet indictment? This is one question perhaps for Antonio. And if the other speakers might want to share maybe other concrete examples of archives that have been able to be very how you say, effective in being able to look at human rights violations in indictments. Back to you, Blondine. Thanks.
Yes. So, as you said, I think the question is first for Antonio.
I will try to answer the question about the role of archives for the Pinochet indictment. I think the process opened by the judge Garzón in Spain in the national audience was one of the first examples of how the universal competence in the universal justice, so-called universal justice, used the archives for trying to trial perpetrators of human rights violations. And in the case of Pinochet, I remember that some records were obtained by the judge Garzón from the so-called archives of terror in Paraguay, in Asunción, in the Center for Archive and Human Rights of the Supreme Court of this country, where are preserved the records produced by the so-called technical police of Stroessner, who was coordinating the Condor operation against terrorist or so-called subversive movements in Latin America, in Uruguay, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and many countries involved in this operation. And from the archives of Asunción came records to the audience, and they were used by the judge. And also some others came from the National Security Archive, an NGO in the States, which is working in declassifying records of the secret services of the United States, and Foreign Office, Central of Intelligence, and others. And there was a project directed by Peter Korbrum, trying to get information on the participation of the secret services of the states in the CAP, and also the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón obtained documents coming from the National Security Archive, this non-governmental organization. I can recommend also the book by Peter Korbrum, The Secret Pinochet Archives, I think is the title, Los Archivos Secretos de Pinochet. There, perhaps you can get more detailed information.
Thank you very much. We have 5 more minutes. Maybe one last question.
Great, thanks, Blondine. Yes, we have many other questions. Sorry very much that we can't get to them all, but maybe a good, nice one to end. Can we redefine the truth in the archives? Back to you, Blondine.
So, who would like to answer that question?
I think you have not one truth. You have many truths, depending on the side you are. Truth is also, the fight for truth is also a work in progress.
Well, yeah, may I say that it's true, we use the term truth, which of course is philosophically debatable, but what is clear, I mean, it is a very pragmatic approach. It is about an evidence-based approach, in fact. It is about facts. It's about establishing facts or knowledge of what happened. And for families of victims, it's very, very concrete. It's about what happened actually to people who were tortured, who disappeared, and so forth. So, I mean, I think this is extremely important, in particular in an era where post-truth and fake news and so on have become a kind of mainstream topics for discussion, and in some cases have I mean, that the very concept of science and objective facts have been questioned by governments. So I think it is important to insist on methodology and on this evidence-based approach. And then, of course, as Perrine said, there are different truths in the sense that then you have different interpretations. But the role of the archives, well, they have not changed in that sense. The role of the archives, in my view, would still be to provide the evidence, and then it's up to historians and many others to bring them together and to interpret and so forth. But the role of the archives has changed in the way that archivists today have a more proactive role. For instance, in terms of preserving collections of documents that can have a significance for human rights. I mean, the archivists today need to take a long-term view on their collections and also try to think of future generations. I mean, I'm not saying this didn't happen before, but I think it has become much more important today. And we hope that some of the tools we have created in the section on archives and human rights can be useful. But again, as Perrine said, this is work in progress.
Antonio?
Let me please, Blandine, to add that absolutely agree with Jens and Perrine. We must consider the word authenticity besides the word truth. And it's not always the same. We can find an authentic document coming from the Stasi that is plenty of lies, of course, but it is an evidence, as Jens has just said. We have the example in the film The Life of the Others, perhaps many of you have seen it, about this amazing history of the Stasi archives and the official working there, and the possibility, the real possibility of that the documents are telling not the truth, they are telling lies, but they are authentic, and as authentic documents, and we must preserve this authenticity, and this is our role, our essential role as archivists, and to put these authentic records in the hands of users in order to construct this truth, and to offer them to the truth commissions, to the transitional justice institutions in the countries, to the courts, to the tribunals. But our role is to guarantee the chain of custody of the documents. They are not altered, and they are integrity. They maintain their integrity and authenticity.
Thank you, Antonio. I think this is a very good conclusion, actually, to about the role of archivists and in guaranteeing authenticity of the archives. I think we unfortunately have to close this session now. There were a few more questions. Sorry, we will not be able to answer them, but of course, I encourage you to read the book. You may find some answers to your questions. And also, if I may, I think the section on archives and human rights of the ICA may be able to help you if you have more questions. Well, Antonio, I don't know if you confirm this or not, but I think this would be a solution for people who would like to have more insight into the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as I said, we unfortunately have to close our session. I would like to thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers, Michelle Bachelet, Perrine Canavaggio, Antonio González Quintana, and Jens Boel. And very warm thanks to the whole team who has worked to produce this event behind the scenes. As you can see on the screen, we would love to have your feedback on this event, and please send your comments and ideas to our email address. As we mentioned many times during the session, you can also visit our page for UN GenevaReads, where you will find more resources on the subject. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Valentine.
Mm-hmm.